charity and an NGO calling for evidence-based drug policy reform rooted in social justice, human rights, and public health. And we believe that legal regulation is the way to achieve this. So getting our drug markets under control, essentially, making substances safer. And my own role, I work a lot on the research side. In the past few months, I've mainly been looking at cannabis regulation in the US, how that's done, and trying to draw up lessons for reform for other countries like the UK moving forward, so that when we regulate cannabis, we do it right. But obviously there's important lessons in there for regulation more broadly. Transform's been doing work on the regulation of stimulants, which we're working towards recently, and I've been helping towards that. We call for local reforms in the UK, and we're also active on an international level. So we attend the Commission on Narcotic Drugs and things like that. So we're really interested in impacting and affecting change at all levels to make drug policy more fair, more humane, protecting the health of people who use drugs and rooted in human rights.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so finally we have Rasheen.
Hey, my internet's a little bad, so maybe if you could signal to me if it's not working. But my name is Roisin Downs. I'm the Global Program Coordinator for Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And what that means is that I support all of our chapters outside of the US. We currently are present in over 30 countries across the world, and we help young people to advocate for drug policies that are based on human rights and anti-racism in place of the war on drugs, and our goal is to end the war on drugs. I've been working for SSDP for just over a year now, and we also do a lot of work internationally, regionally, and nationally, so in lots of different levels. But yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Great, thanks. So now we can move on to the guided discussion, sort of a Q&A. But yeah, as I said before, if you have any questions that rise up throughout the discussion, feel free to put them in the Q&A box. So, very first question, I'll pass to Rasheen. So today's obviously the Global Day of Action, which is really important because it's also the day against drug abuse and illicit trafficking. So I wanted to ask you, why is drug policy and the drug war failing?
Yeah, so the war on drugs is failing for many, many different reasons. It's a really broad thing, specifically for youth. Like young people are often used as a kind of a prompt or a way for punitive drug policies that negatively impact people to be, you know, made and that sort of thing. But these drug policies that are based on punishment, they target people rather than the actual issues, which is generally surrounding health and stuff like that instead. So we all know that like drugs carry risks and whatnot, but they're not inherently bad. They don't inherently damage people, but they can when used in certain circumstances. And instead of dealing with those circumstances that surround, you know, dangerous drug use and stuff like that, we decide to punish the people who are using the drugs instead. And this just causes a series of different issues. You know, you put people in prison, you make them, it results in them not being able to like obtain employment and being included socially. They get highly stigmatized, all of these really negative things that result in whole communities being targeted and that sort of thing. So the war on drugs is failing us in that sense because they're forgetting to protect the people involved in the situation. They're deeming them as bad people or whatever sort of stigmatizing attitude they have towards people who use drugs. And then they punish them for it rather than trying to deal with the issues that are causing the negative kind of circumstances that surround drugs. So that's like how it fails. It's resulted in like things like systematic racism, very large areas of like poverty and stuff like that, because obviously you take away people's economic power, that's what happens. So that's why the war on drugs is failing. What we want to do is replace those things with like healthcare approaches and human rights approaches and approaches that actually lead to social inclusion and kind of the empowerment of the people involved. So yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Audra, I was wondering if you had anything else to add on the human costs of the war on drugs.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, just to add some data to what Roshan said, which was absolutely on spot. is that we should always bear in mind that 1 in 5 people in the world in prison are incarcerated for a drug offense. There are almost 500,000 people in prison just for possession of drugs for personal use. There's another 500,000 of people who are in an administrative detention, so not in prison, just in an administrative process, also only for personal use. So that's just punishing people for being drug users on a massive scale. There's thousands of people in the death row for drug offenses that in some countries of Europe are not even punishable by prison. And according to the World Drug Report that was released yesterday, only 1 in 8 people with a drug use problem have access to treatment, only 1 in 8. So it's a problem of massive dimensions.
Thank you. I wonder, Harvey, if you have, as you obviously come in with sort of a more UK perspective, if you have anything to say about what's wrong with drug policy specifically in the UK.
I mean, all the issues that Rasheen and Adria have touched upon are also an issue in the UK. The war on drugs is international, and the UK is as bad as any actor in the war on drugs. You know, 16% of our prison population are there for drug offences. Drug deaths in the UK were over 4,000 in 2018. Scotland has the highest drug rate death in Europe, if not possibly the world. And what kind of response do we get? We get the Home Secretary talking more and more about getting tough on crime. You know, getting these county lines gangs to stop exploiting people. When it's prohibition that leads to these opportunities for exploitation, it's prohibition that creates these harms. And the war on drugs is a war on people. It's a war on the thousands of people in UK prisons who are there for possessing drugs. It's for supplying drugs, and it doesn't work. It makes everything less safe. It's racist in its roots, and the human cost, as Adria said, is huge. The drug deaths we're seeing in the UK are. We know that the war on drugs is not working. The deaths in the UK are getting higher and higher each year. The number of people exploited as part of the illegal drug trade is getting higher and higher each year. But we don't get a sense of change of policy. We don't get any move for reform. And that's despite the fact that both the Scottish Affairs Committee and the Health and Social Care Committee last year said that the drug deaths in the UK are a public health emergency. And still, we're not seeing any change. We're not seeing any adequate evaluation. We've had a recent report from Dame Carol Black, commissioned by the Home Office, which pointed out that many of the harms, in fact, most of the harms in relation to drug policy are caused by prohibition. And yet, again, we have more of the same from the Home Office. And yeah, so the UK reflects many of the issues that are shared internationally, but it's willing ignorance to evidence-based drug policy, and it's a lack of attempt to improve things and just doubling down on more of the same that's a real issue, and the human cost is absolutely gigantic in the UK as it is everywhere.
Thank you. So Adria, coming from a UN perspective, I was wondering how is drug policy in the UK related to drug policy on the wider scale in sort of the global drug control system?
Yeah, thank you, Dasha. So I think it's very important that we always bear in mind that there are 3 international conventions on drugs that establish a paradigm of prohibiting use of certain substances. And then we can go later on how these substances were decided and how that is inherently colonial and racist in itself. And that these are conventions that are signed up by 190 or 180 countries. So this is like a really large uptake by countries. And countries are bound and they are obligated to implement them in their own national legislations. So that's how the UK is actually forced to illegalize certain drugs just by coming into these conventions. And for the UK, we're seeing now, and we'll come later to that some countries are starting to depart from this modus operandi, and they are starting to legalize cannabis, etc. And this can be easily done by certain countries who have the national resources and the capacity to do that. But for many countries, there's no option to depart from that. And this is something that comes imposed from up. So they don't make their own decisions about what drugs should be legal or not, taking into account their own history and their own traditions. They just get this imposed. And in some cases, these conventions were negotiated when they didn't even exist as a country. So they weren't part of negotiations. And that's deeply flawed.
Thank you. So obviously you mentioned there a bit that the UN kind of works by consensus. And obviously the most obvious place we're seeing that lack of consensus starting to break, or the consensus starting to break down, is in terms of cannabis regulation. Harvey, I know you've been working a lot in cannabis regulation recently. I was wondering what you can say about this, like how things are changing at the moment, what developments there are in cannabis regulation.
Yes, so Adria touched on it as well. We're beginning to see countries regulate cannabis basically in a similar way that many countries without much fuss regulate alcohol and tobacco. When we talk about drug policy, we don't really think about alcohol and tobacco and all the other drugs which aren't made illegal. But these are all drugs. They all have different risks that need to be controlled and managed for in different ways, but we don't look at them in the same way, for instance. And that, as Adria was emphasizing, is what comes and what is the legacy of the UN conventions. But we're starting to see moves away in the regulation of cannabis. So Uruguay has legally regulated cannabis. Canada has legally regulated cannabis. 11 states in the US have legally regulated cannabis or are legally regulating cannabis. And Israel is having votes on the limited legal regulation of cannabis, Luxembourg. And we're seeing the decriminalization of cannabis in more states, meaning it's not necessarily available for sale, but you're not going to punish people who have it on them just for personal use. And the legal regulation of cannabis is hugely positive developments because it's a step away from what we know doesn't work, which is prohibition. We know that people use cannabis. In fact, most people accept the war on drugs doesn't work. They just haven't necessarily adequately thought about what the alternatives are. And there's a referendum going on in New Zealand at the moment. They're going to vote in September on whether to legally regulate cannabis. And I think the messaging for the campaign is spot on. And it's from an advocate's point of view, I think it's something really useful to think about. And the whole messaging is, this isn't a vote on whether we want cannabis to be available. Cannabis is available. A fifth of New Zealanders, or whatever it is, 15%, probably similar to the UK, have tried cannabis in the past year. People use cannabis, right? And that's despite, worldwide, billions of pounds of resources specifically going on trying to stop people from getting this drug, And this isn't about cannabis being available. It's about where it's available. It's about how it's available. It's about whether you access it through phoning a friend of a friend and getting it on a street corner, or you get it from a shop which is licensed to sell cannabis, which is acting under regulations set by the government, and has strict rules on how that cannabis is produced and how it's packaged, with health warnings. And these are all things that are being done in USA and Canada in different ways, but with the same purpose, to protect public health. And it's really important, and these are really vital moves towards an evidence-based policy framework, because the real problem with prohibition is, obviously it doesn't work. People still use drugs, and if people still use drugs, we need to make them safer. We need to make sure that people can be aware of the risks. We need to make sure we're not locking up people needlessly and ruining lives, and that's what the legal regulation of cannabis is a step towards. And hopefully that represents wider moves for reform more generally to progressive drug policy. And just to bring it back round, yes, that does represent the legal regulation of cannabis is not okay within the UN drug control framework. That's not okay, and that's been made clear. And that's where we're seeing the friction now, and that's where something's got to give, and it will soon.
Great, thank you. So sort of following on from that, would you say that the UK has sort of something to learn from all these other different models of regulation and decriminalization in other countries, and what would a possible health-focused model for drug policy look like in the UK?
Well, of course we have something to learn. We should always be looking to learn from other countries, from other drugs, and it speaks to a really deep-rooted problem in people's, and mainly politicians' attitude to drug policy, that we don't think about these things. You know, we don't think about what's been successful in tobacco regulation in recent years, which has actually seen less people using tobacco, you know, without prohibiting it. We don't think about positive developments in reducing teenage drinking and things like that, and we don't look towards other countries. You know, Portugal decriminalized all drugs in the year 2000, I think it was, you know, meaning people who possessed drugs for personal use, they weren't punished, they were diverted into support mechanisms where they were needed, and fully in the spirit of support don't punish, the attitude was to support them, not to punish them, because Portugal was in the throes of a massive drug-related death crisis, and the change in attitude has resulted in death drastically lowering, and that's been a hugely positive development. And that's not something that the UK government has paid attention to in the past 20 years. It's not something it's paying attention to now. We're hearing more about doubling down, and cannabis regulation is another one of these things that the UK, yes, is not listening enough to. It's not, as we hear more and more about county lines gangs from the government, as we hear more and more about organized crime groups selling these evil drugs, we see less and less focus on an actual evidence-based approach to this, you know. And Canada, to its credit, before it legally regulated cannabis, it set up a framework to evaluate the successes and failures of it, to find out how many people were using cannabis, to find out some of the impacts. And that's all useful knowledge that one will help Canada going forward to make sure that its policies are rooted in evidence. But it should help countries like the UK as well, because one of the things that's highlighted is that Canada legalized cannabis. No, loads more people did not all of a sudden start using cannabis, for the same reason that the Netherlands and Amsterdam does not have drastically higher cannabis consumption rates than the UK, for instance, because it just doesn't happen. But what they do have is a framework in which people use the drug more safely, they can access it more easily without having to go to unlicensed suppliers. And those are certainly things that the UK government should be learning from and should be listening to, yes.
Thank you. So we've talked a bit about what the UK can do to implement some more sensible drug policies. Adria, I was wondering what your opinion would be on how the UN can also implement more sensible drug policies on a wider international scale.
Yeah, thank you, Dasha. So the thing with the UN is that it's a system of multilateral institutions where, dozens of countries, if not, like more than 160, 70 countries are always represented. So it cannot take swift action, just like a government can do. It cannot overhaul systems. But there's I would say at least 3 things that the UN system should do as soon as possible. The first one is to understand and be clear about the fact that even if each country has a right to decide what drugs to legalize and what drugs not to legalize and what models of regulation should be adopted for each drug, the use of drugs and the possession for use and any cultivation for personal use should be always decriminalized. And that's something that, believe it or not, it's still hard to, it's impossible to have it accepted in Vienna, and even hard in other circumstances. And that is completely, it's an absolutely ideological position that has no basis on anything and that harms people's lives. And there is no defense whatsoever for it. So that's the first thing they should do. Another thing they should do is that they should be clear about what are the evidence-based health responses to problematic drug use, which is something that it happens, thank God, by now in certain UN bodies like the WHO, but it does not happen still clearly in Vienna. And there are countries that are still saying that, no, they won't provide opioid substitution therapies like methadone or that they won't provide naloxone for no reason. Like, they will never give you a reason. They will say again, ideological things like, oh, it can lead to further use, or things that don't make any sense and cannot be seriously argued. So UN bodies should be very clear about this, about what are the facts on this. Because then people lie. Like, there was, in 2017, there were over 500,000 drug-related deaths, and half of them were due to overdoses and hepatitis C, which can be treated. These are avoidable deaths. There's no reason to have people die without that. And then the third thing that I should the UN do, and that's what Harvey was already pointing to, is that they have to accept that that countries have very different views about how a drug should be regulated. There is no drug-free common horizon that everyone shares, and that's the reality. And they live in a fiction on it. And someday it's going to crumble. I have no doubt about that. We're going to see when it's crumbled and what happens next. But as soon as possible, because it serves no one.
Cool, thank you very much. So obviously, kind of moving on from that, what we've talked about, what we can change. The question is, how do we change it? We have a lot of people here, I'm sure, are interested in drug policy and how they can personally get involved. So I wanted to talk a bit about what young people and individuals can do to change drug policy in the UK and in the UN. So starting with the UK, Harvey, what would you say advocacy and lobbying looks like in Parliament, and how do you think individuals can get involved in that?
First off, I'd say there are a number of great drug policy organisations in the UK for individuals to contact, to get involved with, and that's not just Transform. There's Release, there's other great drug policy organisations in the UK, including ones that work internationally, like IDPC and Harm Reduction International and things like that. The UK has a lot of great drug policy advocates in the UK, and I think it's good to get involved with those where you can. So Transform runs an Anyone's Child campaign, and that's focused around every year, actually, what would be today. They go up to and lobby Parliament as part of Support Don't Punish, and try and get MPs involved, and it's been really successful. And Anyone's Child is a movement that's actually rooted in families. You know, it's people who've been personally affected by the UK's drug laws. It's people who have lost children. It's the idea that it could be anyone's child who suffers as a result of the UK's failing drug laws. So I'd encourage people to get involved in organisations like that. And other than physically going to Parliament and lobbying there and calling for a difference, I think one of the main things that we would say is contact your MP, write to your MP, ask them for a meeting, ask to share your views with drug policy on them. And I think that's really important. And read up on the subject, you know, determine what your views are, share your thoughts with your MP, ask for their views, and try and get a conversation going with them. And it really is a good opportunity to meet with them. And organisations like Transform, if someone wants to meet their MP and they want us to help them out, we have resources available for them. We've got template letters they can send to their MP about the UK's failing drug laws. We've gone with people to meet their MP in the past where they feel like they needed support. You've got resources that they can give to their MP to provide evidence that the drug policy in the UK is failing, and contact people like me. If you're interested in that kind of stuff, get in touch with us, because we are here to help. We love seeing people passionate for drug policy, passionate for change, and it's really important that more and more people speak about drug policy, because the war on drugs isn't working. Drug policy is failing. As I've already said, you know, drug deaths are going up and up and up. More and more people are using drugs. Nothing is working by any measure. Things are just getting worse and worse and worse. But we don't see any change of direction. We see more of the same, and that's because it's not politically expedient at the moment for people to change their minds, to speak out on drug policy. But in recent years, we are seeing developments on that. We're seeing more politicians speak out and call for reform, and that's as a result of people becoming more active and having those conversations. So I'd encourage people to write to their MP, try and meet with their MP, and just get involved more widely, have conversations with friends and family, and get active on social media and talk to people and read up about drug policy and how it's failing and how we can make the case for reform. Attending webinars like this, that's fantastic. It's just about getting as involved as you can. And yeah, anyone who's watching and wants some help with that, please do reach out, because we're happy to be of assistance and help you make a difference.
Great, thank you. I mean, it sounds like there are loads of ways that we can all personally get involved. And obviously, I'm coming from the point of view as a student, and I run a student society. Rasheen, I wonder what you would say about how student organizations like SSDP, like Youth Rise, what we can do to get involved with drug policy lobbying and advocacy at the national level, either in the UK or in other countries.
Yeah, it's there's so many different ways, but what I would say is number one, especially for smaller student organizations, is find out who your allies are. Go and meet other organizations, work in coalition with them, get on their campaigns. It's a really, really helpful way, because especially since young people are often dismissed, for you to be able to encourage them to let your voice be heard as a young person. Like, young people's voices are extremely valid within the conversation around drug policy. We're used as a excuse for punitive drug policy all the time, but then research is rarely ever done into how young people use drugs or how to protect their health and rights while they're doing that. So our experiences are very valid in that space, but it is very difficult to enter those spaces without support, which is like a shame. It is ridiculous that we have to fight for that space, but as civil society and as young people, we need to. So getting on with other organizations, making those strong connections, building coalition, really, really important. The second thing is that I would say it's really important for people to be sympathetic. I think this is something we forget about a lot, but understanding who you're advocating to and who's coming against you, the people who don't agree with you, understanding why they feel that way about certain things. Drugs are scary. They are, and we're all coming from different positions of fear and worried about we want to reduce harm, and we're just coming from two different sides about that, and understanding that other people are coming from fear as well and not ready, and they're maybe not emotionally ready, or they've been fed a certain narrative that causes them to look in a specific way. Making sure that you understand that and don't maybe demonize them for that point of view, because if we don't give people the space to grow and the space to understand new things, we're just going to continue being divisive and separating, and that won't get us anywhere. And we really need to make that progress. So I say that's really important. And as well, I would say focusing sometimes on campus is really important. You'll see, looking at the things that directly affect you. We've seen a lot of campuses having expulsion policies, having really, I'm not sure if this happens in the UK, but in lots of countries there's random drug testing or that sort of thing as well. Those are the things you want to look at, because those are infringements to the rights, your right to education, your right to be treated equally. And looking at those issues is really important. But then again as well, you want to go further. You want to bring that sphere wider. You want to get involved with the community, because not always are very privileged young students the most affected by the war on drugs, though we are very much part of it. Making sure that you bring your sphere further to looking at people who may not have had access to education due to the ramifications of the war on drugs and stuff like that. So making sure that you're you want to build a community within advocacy, and you want to build that space, and then you want to make sure that you're approaching the message in a good way. It is a scary thing to advocate, but it does take a bit of bravery, and it does take a bit of confidence. But once you have that, you can go miles, and you have to be belligerent, and you have to show up at offices and wait hours and hours for that meeting. But you go and do it, and you will make some changes, and it will happen. And even if you're not successful in one meeting, at least you brought attention to the issue. And those are the things that keeps that ball rolling, and you want to keep that going for as long as possible, because this is a global movement. It's not just the UK, it's not just one group of students. We need a consistent global movement, keeping this narrative going, keeping these pushes towards human rights, changing the way we think about drugs, and changing the way we think about punishment as well, moving that narrative to a different place.
Great. So following on from that, Rasheen, what would you say for an individual or a student successful lobbying looks like?
it's a weird question. Successful lobbying, I mean, if you can change a thing, that's like a very obvious mark of successful lobbying. But it is a lot more than that. Like, as I was saying, bringing the attention to the fact is really important. But, I think it's successful if you show up authentically who you are. Like, we are young people. We're going to look like young people and we're going to talk like young people, but we still make our voices heard, and we still come back with that like evidence-based attitude that we have. And we are making sure that we are here with facts and we're here with compassion, because that's what all of this is about. We're being compassionate towards other people who are highly stigmatized or who are whatever, treated badly. And, we are coming from a place of caring. So when you come into that space and you're heard and you're authentically being you, I think that's really important. But I think if you even just go out there and you talk to one decision maker on your campus, and even if they don't like you or they're mad at you for it or whatever, they don't want to do your thing, but you've gone in and you've made the facts and you've presented yourself while you've shown what like, I think that is a success. Because there's not one meeting you go to and you save the world, it's a step-by-step process. So I think it's making that first step to go out there is really hard, really scary, but you got to do it.
Great, thank you. So we've talked a bit about national advocacy and advocacy in the UK. So I want to move on to talking about advocacy on the wider scale and in the UN. So Audra, there are clearly some changes that need to be made in the UN. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how changes are generally made in the UN, like how decisions are made, and what are the role of different bodies such as the CND, INCB, and WHO. So how do all these bodies sort of work together to create change?
Yeah, for sure. And just to add to what Roshan said, there's also space at UN level for young people to show up and advocate. And we had a bunch of them from SSDP in the last Commission on Narcotic Drugs in March. You just, people who haven't been there know how sad a place is the Vienna UN buildings and some of the people who go around there. So it's very necessary that reality-based, hopeful, compassionate spirit that Roshan was mentioning. That's really necessary. Change at the UN works in very weird ways because the UN is a system, as I said before, of very different institutions. And each institution has its own core values and its own culture and its own procedures for adopting resolutions or findings. The thing that they have in common, always, they have three things in common. The first thing is that they work always continuously. So they work every year. And every year, the Commission on Narcotic Drugs meet, and it adopts certain resolutions. And every year, the Human Rights Council meets 3 times, and it adopts resolutions. And every year, the special rapporteurs on human rights do their country visits, and they emit their findings, they have their concluding observations, etc. So you have always a chance to intervene in any of these procedures in civil society. And they happen every year. And the second feature they have is that they build on what has been said in the past, normally. So because these are run by diplomats mainly. So these are people who are very conservative. And they will always look at what has been said the year before and what little tweaks should be done this year in general. The third feature they have, though, is that one body influences the other. So once you have some words, because they always work with words, with language. That's the key fact. So once you have some language that has appeared in the WHO, you can try to bring it to Vienna, which is more conservative. So we work in this sort of always trying to get little changes in languages that we can pass from one place to the other. And it has to be borne in mind that our people who defend different views on drug policy do the same. They're always trying to bring conservative language that gets produced in Vienna to human rights values. And that's the game we are all in. So as I said before, for all of these procedures, there's always formal and informal opportunities for civil society to intervene with submission or just with events, with campaigns. It's just It's set in this way. And there's three things that I think should be borne in mind. And actually, Roshan was quite mentioning them, which is you have to be consistent, because the system is very consistent. Every year they issue their positions, they have the report, etc. And if you show up 1 year and you do something and that's it, it's not going to really make a dent. But because SSDP and because Transform and IDPC go there every year and we do our submissions and we'll build these relationships, that's how you drive change. So even if at the first time they don't take on your ideas, the next year you should go again, and you should sort of bring the same position if it was well argued and evidenced. The second thing is that you have to be timely. So you have to know when you have to intervene. If you are too late, that's not gonna, because all of these decisions are taken with lots of weeks, if not months of preparation. So you have to start working soon enough. And the third thing that you have to be is that you have to be very accurate. You cannot go around saying things that are not exactly true or that are just your interpretations without no source, because then they're going to just it's going to bounce back to you. They're going to say, okay, well, I just don't agree with this. That's not the truth. And if you don't have some documentation on the background that says, no, look, actually putting people in prison for drug use does not reduce drug use, or it's not an effective treatment, and this has been actually researched in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, for instance, etc. That's where you make your gains, because you're coming with a strong argument. So that would be my take on that.
Great, thank you very much. So obviously you mentioned, so Rasheen, SSDP sent over a delegate to the CND this year. Rasheen, I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your experience of youth advocacy at the CND, what it's like to be going as a youth member for anyone here who might be interested in doing the same.
Yeah, so going to C&D with SSDP specifically involves a few different things. So when you first contact us and you're like, I want to go to C&D, we're like, great, really excited, but we ask you to do a little bit of kind of background research. So usually when you come to C&D, we're going to try to organize a meeting with your country's delegation. The reason for this is because they're generally pretty open to talking to civil society. Depends on the country, but generally they'll be okay to have a meeting. They're usually, you have to hunt them down, but it's fine. And what we'll ask you to do to be prepared for that meeting is that we'll walk you through understanding the drug laws in your country, understanding the pressing topics for your country, and then as well taking a look at what resolutions. So the resolutions at the C&D is a country will propose sponsor a resolution, which will be something that the C&D will review, and then they'll workshop the language for weeks, and they'll decide whether or not they want to accept it. So if there's specific resolutions on the table that maybe your country's delegation's proposing or something like that, we want to talk about how we can frame the youth perspective and how you can advocate for what position you might have on that. So, for example, this year, Russia had a resolution on youth involvement in drug prevention. So obviously that was super relevant for us, and it was crazy to read because it was a uniquely odd resolution in the fact that it contained no accepted language from the C&D, which is the biggest UN no. But when that came up, it meant that when we went to go and all talk to our country delegations, we all wanted to talk about that, because we wanted to talk about how are they going to act on that, and what are their thoughts around it, where does Ireland think have their position on it, and that sort of thing. And being able to represent, because it's specifically youth, we can turn around and be like, hey, this is the youth perspective, because as a civil society representative at C&D, you're an expert in your thing, you might not be taken very seriously or whatever, but you're going to try your best. And there is a huge push within C&D over the last few years for increased civil society involvement in the execution of the resolutions and lots of different areas. And it's one of the sustainable development goals as well, the involvement of civil society. So you're able to use these kind of aspects, these little bits to push together for your voice to be heard, for you to be included, and that sort of thing. Also, when you talk to your delegations, they'll usually be pushing some sort of thing that they did this year. So whether it's for when we spoke to the Irish delegation this year, they were talking about how they're bringing in amnesty bins at festivals. And obviously we can then talk to them about what they feel about that, how we think, what our youth perspective is. So we were talking about how we don't think that's enough. It's not an accurate estimation of drugs at a festival, you know, like yada, yada, yada. You give your perspective. C&D is quite intimidating the first time you go, I will admit that. But, you know, especially with SSDP and Paradigma, which is our youth coalition of drug policy reformers that act at the UN, you have a lot of people, you have a lot of support, and a lot of people who are very experienced in C&D, and a lot of people who it's their first year. So we all work together to support it. It can be a bit overwhelming and confusing, but I always think prioritizing those meetings above, like, you know, just watching the C&D happen is quite important, because as well, there'll be people who are already experts in C&D watching every meeting and taking notes on every single section. They can tell you the lowdown later. You go do your meetings, you know. That's where you might be most effective. And then the other great thing about C&D is it's where you meet all the other civil society organizations. It's where you make your connections and you talk to everyone there. So you might not make like policy change at C&D, but you definitely will meet lots of other people who can further maybe your national policy change. So maybe is that a good overview?
Yeah, perfect. I think sort of just to wrap up, I would wonder, do you have any advice for someone who's watching this and wanting to get involved in C&D, or more generally, like, what are their next steps to getting involved in international advocacy?
Yeah, so well, if you're with SSDP or you want to be with SSDP, you send a nice email to myself or my colleague Orshi. Mine's Roisin at ssdp.org, and we will basically start you right now on training to do this. We'll like start going through webinar trainings with you, and then we'll start working on kind of like more personalized, you know, you and your country stuff, to try to get you like prepared for those meetings that you're going to have at C&D. The other thing is that we might take a look into fundraising this year. Sometimes it's, you know, just to get people there. It's because we have to get you to Vienna. It depends where you are in the world. From the UK, it's not too bad. So yeah, those would be our next steps. The other thing is, like, if you aren't particularly knowledgeable on like just the general topics of the day in your country around drug policy, I'd start looking into it. IDPC's website's generally quite good for that, actually. But there's lots of other places that you can look into it. And like getting an idea of what your country's like at C&D, which is hard, but like figuring out how progressive or not progressive your country might be in the kind of whole UN frame of things is quite helpful as well.
Great, thank you. So that kind of concludes our sort of guided discussion. And I just want to say thank you so much to all our speakers. That was really interesting to listen to. But now, obviously, we can open the floor up to any questions that any of our audience might have. I've already got 2 here in the Q&A. So yeah, feel free to just keep adding questions in the Q&A for the next 15-20 minutes, and I will start going through those. So the first one we have is for Harvey. How do you think Brexit will affect the UK in terms of drug policy, as it will depart from the EU, who has made an effort to approach drug use more as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue?
I think it's hard to see too much change in the next few years as it stands in the UK anyway. That might be overly pessimistic, but I think at the moment, the developments in the UK, which we're pushing for, and that there's a real chance to make ground on, are happening kind of away from Brexit-related issues. But in terms of where I see the UK going in the next few years, I think the big developments to watch out for and to advocate for in places like Scotland, where they've been really pushing for overdose prevention centre, a safer drug consumption room, and to combat the record high drug death rates that they've got there, which is basically somewhere where people can safely inject drugs that they've bought on the illegal market under supervision to make sure that they don't overdose, that they don't die. And you know, that for example is the kind of health related measure that the UK is sorely lacking. And it's the kind of measure which advocates are pushing for because it can help save lives. And I think in the next few years, it's maybe not Brexit to think about, but a big kind of issue is the sheer scale of Scottish drug deaths, the increasing calls for independence there. I think that's particularly interesting. And we've got a kind of setup where we've got the Scottish National Party, who really are calling for reform in Scotland. They're calling for more powers under the Misuse of Drugs Act, UK's legislation on drugs. They're calling for more powers to be able to make more health-based interventions, and the UK government is not in favour of those interventions. And I think that's the most interesting thing to watch out for from a UK perspective. And for advocates of the developments more generally, there are a number of growing harm reduction developments, whether that's the movement towards heroin-assisted treatment in the UK, for instance. That would be a fantastic development if that were adopted widely. So I think that's the kind of position that we're in. It's hard to see any drastic change of direction from the UK government at the moment, but that's why we advocate. That's why we do this. We want to change minds. We want to change direction. We want to get people to listen, and that doesn't happen straight away. But if we keep on plugging away, if we keep on making our voices heard, if we keep on sharing the arguments and sharing the evidence base, then over time it does become easier for politicians to acknowledge that the war on drugs is failing, that we need alternatives, and to talk about what those alternatives can be. So hopefully that's the direction we're moving towards, and that's why I encourage everyone to get involved in advocacy in the UK and to push for change.
Thank you. So sort of following on from that, do you think there's more room for reform in the EU versus the UK? I'll give this to Harvey first.
I'm not really sure, to be honest. As Adria kind of focused on, the UK's position is kind of top down from the UN drug control treaties. We're in this, and it's very fervently adopted. The attitude towards prohibition and towards criminalisation of people who use drugs and towards the drug market. And that's the position we've been in for the past 50 years. And with the UN drug control treaty still in place, and with the support for them still here in the UK, I think that's the major issue rather than the EU per se. Although the EU, there's the EMCDDA, the drugs agency in the EU, which does a lot of great work and research and stuff. And I guess one of the big impacts of Brexit will be not benefiting from that kind of research. I think they released a study of wastewater analysis in cities in Europe recently, or a few months ago, where they basically check wastewater to find out levels of drug chemicals to determine how much may have been used of that particular substance. And the UK was included in that, but I guess not being included in things like that going forward means that the UK is missing out. And it's those kind of, it will be missing out in that sense. Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Thank you. Adria, I wonder if you have anything else to add on that issue.
Yeah, thank you. I don't see the EU per se necessarily leads to better drug policies, because drug policies are normally decided at member state level. Well, they're decided at the UN Convention level, and then they get down to member state level because they're seen as a hard topic, like a security matter. So the EU itself doesn't have great powers on that. What the EU does, and it's really, we could all use of that, and Harvey mentioned before, is that it allows for comparisons between countries and to look at what other people are doing. And there's some good stuff going on in certain member states of the EU, some very bad stuff going on too. But there's decriminalization in Portugal, Spain, Italy, some others. There are drug consumption rooms in Spain and other countries. And these are things that the UK could use some learning. And it's the same upside down. Like there's a mixed bag everywhere. So if you just isolate yourself and think that you will look on your own, what are the solutions, that's just not a good recipe in general. So probably not great to live the EU, all in all.
Thank you. So moving on to a slightly different topic, what skills and experiences should young people focus on in order to later pursue a career in drug policy advocacy? I'll pass this one back to Adria first, and then we might move on.
Yeah, I know. Skills. That's a hard question. It's a really hard question. Just like, I think Roshin made a very good case about empathy and evidence-based, and I think these are the main issues. You have to be able to make clear arguments that are well founded, and that's a skill. That's a skill. Like when you have to write essays, you always have to make your arguments and have to back them up, and that's a really great skill. It's a skill pretty similar to being a lawyer in a way. You have to make an argument that's clearly made. And then the second skill that you need is that you need to understand who you are talking with and what they can do and what they can't do, what are their constraints, what are their views. And obviously, if you go there to lecture them or to take the high ground, that's just absolutely not going to work. So these are the two main skills. I think that really, if you do work that is about engaging with people that's a bit different to you, that is a huge skill that you're going to learn. And then you can go from drug policy to whatever. You can do advocacy across many movements. And one thing I wanted to say, and I forgot to say, is that if you want to engage in drug policy, if you want to engage in drug policy, you don't need to engage in drug policy. You can engage in the Black Lives Matter movement. You can engage in prison reform or abolition movements. You can engage in climate change movement. You can work with homeless people. These are all things where drug policy is incredibly present. And just by doing any of those things, I think you are getting really good skills for being one there in Vienna, in Geneva, or in Westminster.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really important point, yes, is the fact that drug policy obviously intersects with so many different social justice movements. So even by working in those, you're still being involved in drug policy advocacy and drug policy reform. So I'm going to move that question on to Rasheen. I wonder if you have anything to add about the sort of skills and experiences young people should focus on for a career in drug policy advocacy.
Yeah, well, you have to be ready to work really hard, especially if you're on the organizing side of things. It can depend where you want to be in advocacy. Like, do you want to be like doing like the researchy stuff? Do you want to be organizing and that sort of thing? And they are kind of two very different jobs, I think, a lot of the time. Organizing is a very like emotionally intensive. It's a lot of work, but it's also like hugely rewarding. Like you see it immediately. But yeah, you have to be ready for that. And I think the skills you need is to be able to listen really well and to be able to give people space to talk out their things. Because I think a lot of the time, at least when I've been doing advocacy, is you have to let the other person make their pitch first, and you have to like accept them and make them feel comfortable. They need to get their bit out, and you have to like genuinely and honestly be listening to that, like not just like letting them say their thing and then saying yours. Like you have to like let them say their thing, take it on, and like, you know, show them the respect that you want back in that situation. And that's a unique skill, but it's also something you learn as you do it. So I would say like one of the things that young people could start doing straight away is like just start going out and advocating. Like go talk to your college people, like you know, talk to the dean of students, go talk to your, you know, wellness officer, that sort of thing. You know, begin to have those experiences where you actually have to make those interactions. Begin to find out like what is your knowledge base, where are your gaps of knowledge. You know, like you might know a lot about maybe decriminalization, but maybe you don't know as much about like safe injection locations, right? So you want to figure out what you do know, what you don't know, and like where you're kind of, you know, yeah, I think that's a good place to start. And yeah, it's the conversational part, I think, is like one of the easiest things to learn because you just start doing it immediately, but it is one of the scarier things to do. But yeah, learning to talk to people who don't agree with you, definitely number one for me.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, just to jump in there as well, I think for me, but being the president of an SSDP chapter, if you can do that, start a chapter if your university doesn't have one, you will learn so many skills that are so relevant. And somebody's also put in the comment section, having volunteering experience and harm reduction, working on the front lines is also essential. So Harvey, I just wondered if you had anything else to add on this topic.
I think those are all really great answers. I think, and Rasheen talked about it, I think key skills in drug policy are empathy and patience. Not many people think the war on drugs is working. It's just they haven't been convinced by the alternatives. They don't understand the alternatives. And I don't think it takes too long to actually know quite a bit about drug policy. It doesn't take too much reading or too much time. And obviously, the more you get into it, the more you know and more of an expert you become, sure. But people generally don't know a huge amount about drug policy or what the alternatives are. And that's why things like legalization of cannabis is so terrifying for them, because it's always misinterpreted as, well, you want loads more cannabis. There's too much cannabis already. I don't want that. It's those kind of the ways that people misunderstand what drug policy reformers are calling for. That a lot of it doesn't stem from disagreements. You know, people agree that we want the drug markets under control, that we want a focus on public health. It's about being in a position to explain the alternatives to them, having the patience to be able to do that, and having the empathy to be able to listen to them and help them understand why those things make sense, because reform does make sense. And people don't really need a lot of convincing that the war on drugs isn't working. They just don't know much beyond that.
Thank you. So we have quite a specific question next. So somebody has said that the WHO Expert Committee in Drug Dependence issued a re-evaluation on cannabis, THC, CBD, potentially with some, potentially with some rescheduling recommendations in 2018, if they're right. They believe it was Vienna's turn to vote on rescheduling cannabis, but this voting was postponed potentially twice. Do any of you have any updates on when or whether this voting will take place? I'll pass this to Adria first.
I do, but I think Harvey is like our cannabis dude here. So I don't know if you want to take that one, Harvey.
Yeah, that's fine.
They delayed the vote until December, didn't they? I'm right in that. It's quite a complicated rescheduling sort of thing. I'm relatively new to international drug policy in the scheme of things, so maybe Rasheen will be able to say more again, but the whole system of scheduling is very confusing, and it's not a complete rescheduling of cannabis. It's not going to be some dramatic change. It's only certain medical properties of cannabis, and it's moving them to a different schedule and away from a schedule which would say that there's absolutely no medical good that can come from cannabis, which is looking more and more out of touch and more ridiculous the more places that medical cannabis is adopted and the bigger the medical cannabis industry becomes. But yeah, I don't know if Rasheen and Adria want to add anything to that.
Yeah, when we were at C&D this year, this came up, which is why we titled this year's C&D as the most boring C&D ever. Because it was either going to be the best or the worst. But yeah, basically they brought up the rescheduling. It was meant to happen on, it was like C&D day 2 maybe. And yeah, it showed up and like all the countries are like, yeah, we're ready to vote. It gets to Russia. Russia's like, we haven't had enough time to read the evidence, and we want to see, maybe, I think they might have said they wanted Russia specific evidence, which they won't like do themselves either way. So like, what can you do? But yeah, that's why it was pushed off. And then a bunch of other countries also like after that was like, yeah, we also haven't read the evidence yet provided by the WHO. So it's been pushed to December. I wouldn't be surprised if it was pushed again, since basically there's a series of different reconvenings across the year, and the December reconvening would happen, but I'd say due to COVID and all of those restrictions, they might attempt to push it again. I wouldn't be surprised, but yeah. And as far as I know as well with the scheduling, basically if they were to reschedule it to a different way, when they reschedule, it just means like that's the base punishment. So like say if they magically scheduled it as a totally legal recreational drug, every country could still decide we want to have that like as the most punishable drug in the world, because it's just a base level, you know? So it's not, yeah, it wouldn't have like a major effect immediately, but it would be grounds for advocating for the loosening of regulation around cannabis.
Yeah, if I could add something to that. At CND, decisions are taken by consensus always, which means that they adopt these resolutions that everyone agrees. It's perfect. It's a perfect world, finally. There's one exception though, which is on scheduling of substances. So every year they vote on which particular substances are going to be in the blacklist, international. And they have 4 different blacklists. So they actually have 8 different blacklists. And for this, they vote. They're allowed to do that. In the case of cannabis, yes, as I said, they're just moving it from one blacklist to the other. And the political implication for that, though, is that you are acknowledging that there's some medicinal use to cannabis. And at the moment, the system in Vienna is so fragile that they don't dare take a vote on that, although they can. But things are so, like, there's so much fight and so much hidden disagreement that even when they can vote, they would prefer to go to consensus, although they can't, because they know that there's not going to be any consensus. So they're just postponing with this spirit that maybe some magical thing will happen. And yeah, we hope that it's going to be voted in December and hopefully adopted just as a sign. It won't have great implications right now, practically, but politically, as I said before, like, these are processes that work by accumulation, and it's like year-to-year progress, and that would be progress for sure.
Great, thank you. So I'll just move on to the next question. How would you implement education of evidence-based policies, not just for young people, but also for worried parents and currently misinformed members of the community? Roisin, I wonder if you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so I personally believe in peer-to-peer education as one of the most effective forms of drug education. What that means is, rather than having your drug education coming from an authority figure, so like a teacher, a doctor, a policeman, you know, like that space, that it comes from your peers. And SSDP has a fantastic drug education program that is called Just Say No, spelled KNOW, like to have knowledge, which I love explaining out loud. But yeah, it's a really effective program because it basically just trains our peer educators to be able to talk to their friends, and not even just talk to their friends, but to be able to present modules in class or when they go into the workplace. You know, some workplaces have their kind of wellness week things, and you can present drug education there, but it comes from a space that's not necessarily someone who's related to power over you in any way. And that's something that can, like, you know, power's corruption a lot of the time, that can affect how drug education is perceived. And bearing in mind as well that, like, we have at least been lied to in drug education usually sometimes in our lives, or at least been misinformed or directed in specific ways that gives us a natural distrust of drug education in general. So making sure that the delivery of the drug education is authentic as possible, because if you just tell people, like, these are the worst things that'll happen, you know, you'll take cocaine, you die, and then you see someone take cocaine and they don't die, and you're like, well, that was all lies, and you ignore everything else they said. And so you want to make sure that you have, like, you know, you include the positives and the negatives. You want to make sure that the person actually believes what you're saying. But when it comes to talking to parents and families, it's really important that they just understand not to stigmatize people who use drugs, and you kind of start from that space of, like, helping them understand why people use drugs, understanding the different kind of reasons why people might use drugs. And like, I think that's where I would start with drug education for parents and families, rather than going specifically into the drug education, because I think the number one best thing that family and peers can do for people who use drugs, who might be in a chaotic relationship with drugs or something like that, is not give them the advice how to use their drugs safely, though that is very important, that they actually just provide them with space to be able to discuss their drug use in, like, a non-judgmental space, and take away a level of fear that can often be involved with discussing drugs. So that's where how I would go about it there. I do believe drug education should be in schools at all levels. But I feel as well it would be very difficult to deal with the bureaucracy of getting that into schools at all levels. But yeah, I would definitely go in the line of as authentic as possible and focusing on the destigmatization and the opening of conversation.
I wonder if anyone else has anything else to add to that.
That was perfect as far as I'm concerned.
Wow. Well, let's move on to the next one then. This is for Harvey again. How much independence does each country in the UK have to adapt more harm reduction driven policies?
Well, so that's a bit of a contested question. So I guess that's coming from what I touched upon before about the UK Misuse of Drugs Act. If the person else that wants to get in touch with me, I can probably write a fuller answer than I can give now, because it is quite a complicated issue. But essentially, there is debate over how much powers, for instance, Scotland has. Scotland's saying that Scotland doesn't. So the Misuse of Drugs Act, which is the UK legislation introduced in 1971 and provides the main framework in which drugs supply, possession are criminalised, doesn't give sufficient room for instance, the Scottish government to introduce a safer drug consumption facility. And that in particular is a point of tension at the moment, because as I was saying, they want to do that to help save lives, and that's the kind of position we're in at the moment. But perhaps if you want to get in touch with me or send me an email, I can get back to you with a fuller response. I can put my email in the chat. That might take some time.
Great, thank you. So moving on to a slightly different topic, to what extent does alcohol come into these policy discussions, including higher taxing, prioritizing pubs over off licenses, etc.? Does anyone want to jump in on that question?
Well, I can start a bit. It's a very big question. I think on a practical level, it rarely comes to discussions, because we're talking always about illegal drugs. At least from the policy reform side, we do bring alcohol at the table, because we try to, when we have this fabulous diagram where we explain what are the harms of drugs, legal and illegal. There's been like some really serious peer-reviewed studies showing that alcohol is by far the most harmful substance that exists in our societies, but exceeding just infinitely other substances. So that's as far as we bring it to the table. And that's the first thought. The second thought is that we don't like to get involved in harm reduction in alcohol. At least I would say I don't like it, because then we have the alcohol industry, which is a really, really bad actor in many ways. And I don't want to be the stooge for the alcohol industry, as I don't want to be the stooge for the cannabis industry or any other industry in general. So it's a very touchy subject, and we tend to avoid it. It's very important, though, that I'm going back to how I started, that to understand that in the from 1930 to 1960, when they defined what was legal and what wasn't illegal, it was just a bunch of white guys deciding that the drugs that they took were legal, which was alcohol and tobacco, and the drugs that they did not take, but other people took, they were illegal globally forever. And that's a very important framework to have in mind always.
Thank you. I wonder, Harvey, if you have anything to say about specifically in the UK to do with alcohol, how alcohol comes into policy discussions.
Yes, I mean, at Transform, I think we engage with alcohol policy a bit more. And I think a key reason for that is, as an organisation which calls for the legal regulation of drugs, we have to look towards other drugs which are legally regulated. And there are important lessons to learn. So, for instance, a major lesson as we move to more cannabis reform, we have to look at, as Adria said, big alcohol, the big corporates in alcohol that and tobacco as well, actually, which have historically had a huge amount of lobbying power that's led to bad public health outcomes, because you've obviously got a friction if you're a big alcohol company that wants to sell lots of alcohol and actually your drug is quite harmful. You want to sell more of it, and you're selling a lot of it to people who potentially need help, and your sales tactics potentially increase harm and and lead to deaths, and it's an awful situation to be in. But that's why you need stricter regulation. That's why you need greater control. And I think alcohol policy, we often use it as an example because, one, it transformed. Just, we call for the legal regulation of drugs. We don't think alcohol is regulated well enough. Alcohol, as Adria said, is a really, really dangerous drug. It's widely taken. It has huge personal and societal harms, and it's largely very freely available. You can go to a supermarket and buy as much alcohol as you like. There's all this fancy branding on it. It's on adverts. It's on, you're watching the football, and as soon as it comes to half time, there's an advert telling you to get another drink. It's very poorly regulated. And as we look to plan the regulation for other legal drugs, there are so many lessons in what to avoid. And I think it's important that we tackle those head on. And obviously there are good developments in alcohol policy as well. And there's people working in alcohol policy who make important arguments that can be transposed into drug policy more widely. So in that respect, I think we're quite engaged in that. And I think it's quite important to be mindful of it, yeah.
Just to add on there as well, I think it's quite helpful for at least young drug policy reformers. A lot of countries have in Ireland, we have Drink Aware, which is about, responsible alcohol consumption. Lots of universities will have a lot of kind of wellness around responsible alcohol consumption. And sometimes you see it in communities as well. It's always a really nice place to go in and make your spot for harm reduction around drug use. It can be so easy. It's where you can build your relationship and become part of an institution that may be anti-drug, but you might be able to convince them to be not anti-drug but pro harm reduction, and come in from that angle, because they already understand the concept. You just got to widen their ideas of it.
Thank you. So we're just coming up to the end, so I'll just take one more question, and then obviously I'm sure you guys can email these guys. They'll be available to answer questions afterwards. So the final question is, with the scathing review by the Home Office of the Psychoactive Substances Act 2016 in the UK, is there any chance that changes will be made to it? And in the Netherlands, an MPS ban has been proposed. Do you have any thoughts on that? Should I start with Harvey?
Again, if you maybe want to email me, I might be able to provide more information just because we're running out of time. But I don't see, the Psychoactive Substances Act is a very odd piece of legislation. I don't know if anyone's ever read it, but you've got this big clause at the start which says any kind of psychoactive substance which causes these particular effects in people is, it's prohibited to supply it to other people. And then obviously you have to have a big disclaimer at the end of it which says, obviously we're not talking about these three drugs, caffeine, alcohol, and tobacco, because they exactly fit that description as well. I don't see any changes being made to the Act anytime soon. And that's more just because of the political situation we're in, to be honest. There's lots to regret about the Act and the approach to MPS generally. And it's an important place where we can make reforms, because obviously I think MPS are coming back onto the agenda, particularly in COVID as well, actually. So I think there's a lot of room for advocates to do stuff. I don't see any change happening directly anytime soon.
I wonder if anyone else has anything to add to that. If not, I think we can leave it there. But I just want to say thank you so much to all of the speakers. This has been a really interesting discussion. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience have as well. So thank you for the audience as well for participating. And I guess we'll leave it there. So goodbye for now. And we have another workshop coming up at 5:30. You can register on the Eventbrite, which will be on our Facebook page.